I'm going to show my favorite way of seaming up these simple slippers. These can be crocheted, knit, whatever. It's a very simple design. It's been around for quite a while. There's a lot of videos out there and everybody has their favorite technique for finishing these. This one I added a round of single crochet and another round of slip stitch, and I decreased every 4 or 5 stitches to snug that up a little bit around the top of my foot. These slippers were made with Barcelona from Michaels, and I did 44 rounds, and I didn't put much tension on the yarn, and they came out just right. I was able to measure on the knitting machine as I went to get the length of my foot. But I tried the same thing with this yarn, and I ended up with this giant slipper like this. So if you have a strange yarn, it's better to do a tension gauge and make sure that your slipper's not coming out too big. So I ended up tensioning my yarn a little bit more as it was feeding into the knitting machine, and I did 40 rounds instead of the 44 on the other yarn. And the way I calculate my foot is I measure the length of my foot standing flat, and then I subtract 10%. I usually do that for all socks, and that way when it stretches onto your feet, it'll draw back in enough to keep it snug on your foot. So do some practice gauges first so you'll know how many rounds to do for your foot. Okay, I knitted a waist yarn to begin with and a waist yarn at the end. And I did a simple, just what we call the weaving cast on or the drawstring cast on to begin with, and I just used a needle bind off on the end. You don't really have to, but you know, every time I don't do it, my waist yarn starts unraveling and it drives me crazy. So it's not that hard to go ahead and just needle stitch it off of the machine. So I'm going to use a crochet hook and I'm going to slip stitch my seams. I'm going to seam the top and the bottom, and I'm going to make a double layered, just a rectangle of fabric to make the slipper. And to begin with, I'm going to locate my yarn that I'm going to crochet with, and it's a long tail that I left at the beginning and the end. And you just find the gap where the beginning of the round is, and you need to locate all 46 stitches. If you're not sure which one of these is your first stitch or whatever and you're having a hard time locating it, just count your stitches and make sure you have identified all 46 needles, because each stitch has to have a pair to crochet together. And so I usually just tug on my waist yarn and I find the first loop that I want to call my front side, and then I'll pull on the tail of the main yarn and decide what stitch I want to match it up with. And usually if you're not using really thick yarn, you can usually see it pretty well. So if I get to the end and I end up with an odd number of stitches, then I know that I didn't choose the right stitches at the beginning, or I skipped a stitch somewhere along the way. So if you do that, go ahead and rip it out and locate the stitch that you skipped, because if you don't, your slipper's going to run, the knit stitches are going to unravel. Okay, to begin with, pick your first pair of loops, poke your needle in from this side and straight through to the other side, and grab the pair on it's made on the other side, and then just get ready to crochet. So to set up, I'm only going to have 2 loops on my needle, so my crochet hook, so I'm just going to grab a loop and pull it through those 2 knit stitches. So now I have a loop on my needle already, so I'm going to locate the next pair, and I'm going to poke my crochet hook in the front and then through to the back, and now I have 3 loops on, and I'm just going to slip stitch through all 3. And I'll do that all the way to the end, making sure that I have all 23 pairs. I want to say also, if you did not leave a long enough tail at the beginning and end with your main yarn, you can go ahead and add, you can also crochet straight off of the ball of yarn and do this, and you'll just have more tails that you have to weave in. Okay, I'm down to the last two, and they kind of just close in on each other. So you just go just like the rest of them, and just go in there and then across there. They just look a little funny at the end. So when you're done with this, you can just pull your tail through. But don't cut the yarn, because we need this to seam up the back of the heel of the or the toe, whichever end you're going to choose to be the heel or the toe. But we need this to seam that back heel up. I usually do the heel first, and then you can remove your waste yarn, and I usually look for the tail with this type of a cast on, and you'll see this little loop that's passing straight through all these stitches. You can just cut that, and then that'll make the stitches live. If I didn't split the yarn somewhere, I should be able to pull that completely out, and now I have live stitches that are easy to unravel. If you don't undo that first round, you just have to pick it out stitch by stitch, and but now I've got live stitches, so all I have to do is find that little tail that I left and just unravel from here. I'm going to seam up the other side exactly like I seamed this one side, and then I'm going to remove the waste yarn. I've got both ends of the tube sewed up, and I'm going to sew up the heel. I usually take the end that has the shortest tail, but I think I have plenty on both of them. And when you're looking at your slip stitches, they kind of lean more to one side. You can see the V here, but on the other side it's not as visible. You see more of the bumps on the other side. So whichever way is easier for you to see the loops, just fold the fabric in half, and I think I'm going to do it like this. And you can decide how many loops you want to grab. You can sew through 2 loops at a time on either side. And when I say sew, I mean crochet the slip stitch. You can grab 2 loops on each side like this. Well, I can't poke my hook through there, but I normally just grab 1 loop, the back loop of the front one and the back loop of the back one. And this one you have to lean forward a little bit because it's pointing away from you. That's why I was having trouble getting my hook in there a while ago. But I like to go through 1 loop. If the seam is a little bit weaker than you want it to be, then go through 2 loops on the front and the back. So I'm going to try to get this around where I can see it. And I'm going to start off on the very edge to secure that. And I'm going through 2 loops on the edge just to get this started. And then I'm going to start slip stitching just to set this up. So now I've got a loop on my hook, and I'm going to grab the back loop of the front stitch and lean this over where I can see, and then I'm going to grab 1 loop on the back, and I'm going to pull through all 3. And just keep repeating to the end. You can also whip stitch this seam closed, but I like the look of the slip stitch. So whatever you want to do is fine. Just be consistent with where you put your needle or your hook. You want to go all in the same line. And just sew all the way to the fold. I'm at the end of that seam and I'm coming to the last little point at the edge of the heel, or at the fold here. I'm just going to poke my crochet hook in at the last couple of loops there, and then just pull that through and then tie off. And then I'll come back later with a needle and weave that tail in. You can choose whether you want this to be the outside of the slipper, or if you're worried about that ridge on the inside, you may not want to do it this way, but just choose which side you like the best. I think I'm going to leave it with this yarn. It feels a little lumpy, so if I were using this yarn to make a slipper, I would probably put this on the outside. This is too short to be a slipper, it's just a sample piece, but that's how you just decide what you want to be on the outside. And on the other side, we're going to run a stitch all along all of these loops and make a little drawstring and draw up that toe. We're going to gather it all up. So let me thread my yarn and into a needle, and then we'll do that. This is another place where you can decide how many loops you want to grab to do your gathering. I like to grab one loop because it makes a thinner gather on the end. This sock ended up pretty bulky because I grabbed a couple of loops and then I skipped a bunch of stitches, and it just ended up bulkier than I wanted it to be. This one's really flat and nice, and I only grabbed one loop at a time on that one. So you just simply take your tail or another piece of yarn if your tail's not long enough, and I've got to turn this around where I can see those slip stitches because they are leaning toward that side. At this point, it doesn't matter whether you're at the outside of your slipper or the inside, doesn't matter. So I'm just going to go in and out. I'm going to grab one loop across the back here, back, front, back, front. I'm going in and out, just zigzagging in and out, and then you can every now and then pull your thread through or your yarn, and then just continue all the way to the other end. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and pull the rest of that through, and I'm just going to start drawing this up, just pulling on it. And I want this to be my outside, so I'm going to leave the slipper like this before I start seaming. So right now it's not going to stay closed until you join it at the end. And sometimes I'll take my needle, depending on the yarn, and I'll go around, I'll just run it around this little circle just to close that up tighter. Just what depends on the yarn that you're working with, whether you'll need to do that or not. So I'm just going to tie a knot here at the end after I draw this up. And that seems pretty tight, so I probably don't need to run my needle all the way around that. That looks good to me. And then now we're going to start sewing up the top of the foot right across here. And I used a mattress stitch on here. You can turn the sock inside out and just whip stitch it closed if you don't want to do a mattress seam. But that's what I like. So sometimes the yarn is really fluffy and it's hard to see your stitches, so just do what's best for your yarn. So what I want to do is locate a row or a column of these knit stitches and stick with it once I choose the column that I'm going to sew into. And sometimes it's hard to tell by looking at this which is the actual knit column. So if you'll just kind of stretch your yarn apart, or your fabric apart, you can see the little knit stitches that are looped in and out of each other here, and in between you'll see these little ladders. What we're going to be doing is stitching in the V's of these knit stitches and grabbing these little bars that are in between. So I think I'm going to use this column of stitches along here. Once you start poking your hole down this line here, be consistent where you stick your needle, because if you sometimes go in here and then sometimes you skip over and go in here, it'll make an uneven seam. And so I'm going to find my stitches on the other rim of the slipper also, and decide which column of stitches I want to sew into. And sometimes you might want to put a marker in there so you can help yourself go back to that same column. Like I would just mark it right here that I've found the column that I want, and then this one. So if I get lost, I can follow where I want. And also at this point you might want to fold your slipper in half, and because when I did mine I went halfway up the slipper to where the top of my foot would stop, and then you can go ahead and place your marker at that point where you want to stop sewing. You have to leave enough room here to get your foot in there. So this is my column of stitches here on this side. So I'm going to follow that down, and it's starting to kind of curve down into where I close this seam up. So I'm just going to follow it down and then reach in there in the middle of one of these stitches and find that bar. Got a knot in my yarn. Probably have more yarn than I need here, and you don't have to pull tight at this point. I usually do a few stitches at a time. So here's my column of stitches, and then I'll reach in there and grab that bar or ladder, and I'll leave it loose like that so I can see where the stitch. I'll pull on it and I'll see this stitch is coming out of here, so that's where I want to go down and grab the next bar. Then I'll come across to this side, go in where that stitch is coming out, and grab the next bar. And you keep going back and forth from front to back until you get the top of the foot sewn as far up as you want to go. And then every few stitches you can stop and tug on that, and it'll close that seam. But then I always pull it back out a little bit so I can see where I left off. And my tension on this yarn wasn't very tight, so all of these stitches knitted up pretty loose. I'm looking to where that came out. And then just keep sewing up the top of the slipper until you have reached the point where you want to stop. Okay, I'm at the end of my seam, so I'm going to go ahead and remove my markers and go ahead and pull this up. And the mattress stitch is really nice because it makes an almost invisible seam, and there's not a big bump on the other side against your foot. And when you get to this point here, you can turn the sock inside out and then just join, or I'm calling it a sock, but it's a slipper. Just join your yarn, or make a little join here to secure that opening. And then weave it, just run the leftover tail through a few stitches. I'm not going to do very many because this is a sample. And then you would just hide the tail down between the layers and then cut your yarn. And it'll disappear up into the layers. And you can call your sock or your slipper finished at this point, but I liked one round of single crochet around the top edge of the slipper, and then I added through the back loop another round with slip stitch through the back loop. and I decreased every 4 or 5 stitches to snug up the ankle a little bit, and that gave it just enough body to stay up on my foot where I wanted it to be. And I was crocheting through 2 loops when I was doing my single crochet all the way around, and you can go as many rounds as you want. And then I would join here, and then I'd do a round of single crochet through the back loop.